Hello everyone, today we talk about trade goods and manufacturing production in high medieval Europe. So this is a very specialistic topic, telling the truth. I'm no expert on it specifically, so we're gonna trace a very essential introductive picture of the world. So first of all, starting from, what are the guidelines? I mean, how do we study medieval economics when it comes to understanding in terms of things like production, trade routes, and how was about the local consumption, even such goods, etc. Well, of course, archaeology is quite important. It's not only today we will be discussing chiefly about the times like the 12th century, where when we don't have a huge amount of documentation. Like if you start talking about the 13th, the 14th, we have written material that starts telling us really a lot. The 12th century was a moment of great growth and expansion, but at the same time, it's still kind of closer by a certain degree, at least to say previous centuries in terms of sources of actual finds and what we can know about the material culture of those times. So I feel the word quite a substantial both qualitative and quantitative progress is being made is the one of crockery. So this terracotta objects fundamentally that is very important today for historians, because it's kind of a fairly average product in terms of it's fairly widespread, and at the same time it's not really a luxury good, but it's still something that shows a substantial well-being, where you have this material that is available, being bought even by middle classes, etc. You realize that here there is some economical dynamism, some surplus that doesn't make you see the local economy like a survival one, right? So the attention towards medieval crockery was by the way also overlooked for quite some time to the advantage of the ancient one. Because it was somehow more intention for the ancient world, more a greater value attributed to these more ancient artifacts, etc. All the great problems of how effectively the ancient world had handed, even in junction, let's say, with the beginning of the Middle Ages. So as if the Middle Ages, were quite not important. So the great studies thinking about Pyrrhen's etc. revolved around this, tracing through finds like shipwrecks, etc. how much especially was shifted still, especially into the Mediterranean from west to east, to understand how lively was the economy of that time. So in relatively more modern times, the attention has been turned now towards the Middle Ages in this phase of continuous growth, actually, that at this point in the 12th century was really becoming something very substantial, even quantitatively but also qualitatively, for the techniques of production, etc., that you have to recall are never to be interpreted as a real technological progress, or better, as a technology that triggers the growth, but the other way around. In other words, producing these manufactures wasn't quite of a huge technical accomplishment, but it proves that there was, first of all, enough demand, evidently enough wealth to be able to afford this stuff, and to expand the means of production, both quantitatively and qualitatively, so with the introduction of new techniques, innovation, etc. So this kind of technological progress that comes from a series of preconditions that could make it possible. So this material, especially this crockery, is able to permits us, let's say, to study the certain levels of material life of people living at the time, because this were, by the way, used products. There were things that were worked, kind of manufactured with a certain degree of quality, and also they start being produced in series. So it stops that that phase of medieval economy in which the single object is just, something maybe very well, already substantially well done, but it's destined just to it's produced kind of just every once in a while on occasion, and also usually for the need of local consumption, right? Here we start having a systematic and structural growth, where there are certain communities that start working these objects for exporting them in series, we could say, which is, depending on how anachronistic you want to call this term fundamentally, but it was about producing a lot of stuff that was continuously exported, because there was a market where was requesting then on a regular base, naturally, with all the cases of of context in terms of competition, etc., different stories of the local centers of production, etc. But if you look at the whole picture of Europe at this time, there is a pretty substantial growth under this aspect, and there are at this point, this is really a big turning point into medieval history, because for the first kind of time, by approximation, you have now entire communities that are even depending on such manufacturing activities, and that start. This doesn't happen just in terms of artifacts, manufacts, but also in other goods. Like there were certain regions of Europe that were particularly, famous for a certain type, like, for vineyards, take Bourgogne that we were talking about yesterday. It was said, maybe just obviously with some exaggeration, that by the 13th century especially, this country was so wealthy that it could produce so many grapes and wine that these guys could live just of wine exports, right? Obviously it's not the case. No community at this moment depended solely on this on these exports. Still the majority of local production was still agriculturally measured, let's say. But at the same time, these statements show us that, and they were told not just, anecdotally, that they were still said like something new, like somebody presented something important that was not the average, or at least up to that point it had not been. So it tells you that there was something changing in these strategies, let's say, of production. That are that show the increased specialization of local economy, right? And for which, in fact, it's interesting even to look at the various differences that we will see afterwards on a kind of a ideal map of not just of Europe but also Mediterranean, broadly meant. And there were several innovations as well, as we said before, that now we're gonna list. Excuse me, I have to check one thing first. There is the introduction, for example, of the Throttle. The Throttle is this wheel, pedal wheel, let's say, that through which the artisan could work, for example, at the shape of the vase with both hands at one time. So to model it using both legs and hands same time, to make it kind of qualitatively better, faster, etc. So as we were saying before, it's not that people didn't have these things before because they were stupid, and it took this invention to make economy grow. It's that before nobody cared pretty much about having vases to produce with that quality or in that quantity, because there was no market where to export that on a regular base. So this is always how we have to look at it, and it's pretty average throughout all history. The technological element it also definitely has an impact on the growth, but it's overwhelmingly minority into it. It's mostly and largely a consequence of a growth than it is its cause, which in part, however, still obviously helps. So these techniques, for example, this technique like the Throttle, for example, were definitely allowed a better quality of the product, greater speed in production, as we said before. In the first years of the 14th century in the West, there is also the first appearance of glazed ceramic that were created this with a compost of that included based on tin, actually, that was meant to imitate the Chinese porcelain. And this procedure had been learned through the Arabs, chiefly through the Arab world, and this new ceramics led to what eventually would have been called more famously in the West the maiolica, right? At this point, some of the most famous maiolicas in medieval Europe were from central northern Italy, especially the city of Faenza. At the end of the 12th century, there is the spread in the West, and especially in regions like Normandy, England, and Italy, the art of glass making, right, of production. This already kind of existed in some form, but now it gets substantially enhanced. So up to that point, this glass making technique had been sort of a theoretically a jealously held secret, at least in theory, of the Eastern world, right? So the manufacture of colored glass was spread since the roughly the 70s of the 12th century, and it was extremely important. Think about this. Why do you think this? Have you ever thought? Thinking the end of the 12th century, this was the great spread of medieval cathedrals and their beautiful glass windows. So this all the great cathedrals, especially of course in the north, in England and northern France, that required such elaborated glasses that now were meant to depict very complex figures, to have all a let's say a role into the world, that were all one, let's say, with the ideal of the cathedral, this idea of being able to make light filtering inside the cathedral, and light used as a constitutive element of architecture, unlike it had been into the Romanesque one. So these extremely elaborated glasses that represented the histories, of course, of the Bible, etc., were now requiring this greater capacity of, first of all, the first problem is always having the material available, then knowing at least the raw material, then knowing how having at least a class of artisans that you can rely on a regular base. The West at this point was constantly connected to the East, so even in much previous times you had however, normally, because it was more convenient economically speaking, the Westerners actually buying materials or even craftsmen from the East or from other areas. Think about, I don't know, just something militarily that came into my mind, the fleet of William the Conqueror that he used to invade England. Well, he had Byzantine carpenters coming there to build up the ships, not because they didn't have ships, but because he needed something larger for such a big an expedition. So better craftsmen and knowing how to build things well and fast. So this is all a kind of economical proportion. And where is money, there is also job. So there are people going there just to work, and people locally learn the craft etc. And that transforms itself from something occasional to something structural, where you're able to replicate that particular art and technique into the local areas. That starts, in fact, as we've seen, to specialize specifically in this production, become kind of more famous around for reasons that naturally vary, but they have to do with many factors: the local availability of materials, or the particularly happy geographical location in terms of relative to trade routes, etc. Governments that are able to invest in these activities as well, and therefore requiring people who are able to perform this craft. So it's very complex. Sometimes we don't have all the data coming together, but we can definitely identify these macro differences in the various regions of Europe. Green and red glass was produced adding copper to the glass paste, brown and yellow by adding iron, azure with blue with a compass that from an Arab term was called Sulfur. Then there are definitely other fields expanding, like the ones of textiles and leather production, that these were very important resources, especially in terms of clothing and military equipment as well. Thinking about the gambesons, even some kind of leather protection in combat, etc., and for clothing, which is obviously self-explanatory. And textile and leather production were kind of a long and articulated business, right? It was particularly difficult, and that's why it required, let's say, several phases and several techniques and specialists in order to be carried out. So it was usually concentrated in smaller places, specific places that, as we were saying before, were particularly fitting for developing this activity, and that met with certain basic needs. For example, the abundance of water that is needed not just for the working processes, like for let's say interacting with the substances and materials, etc., but also for force, for physical force, sometimes with mills, etc. And there is a transformation of the local environment in part. We have seen that the 12th century is especially this great moment of expansion of feudalism. That is literally a physical expansion. Like, there are areas of Europe that are deforested and dried up, bonified, let's say. And that change aspect. This starts occurring also in other pre-existing centers that are influenced by these local productions, and this production sometimes transformed the local environment into something, let's say, worse, kind of unhealthy compared to what it was before, because of all this of pollution in many ways, because and therefore it was born a problem that would have become kind of more evident and structural and imposant of much later time, that is the modern age, but that was already felt into the High Middle Ages. That is the relation between the production, the condition of life conditions of the less affluent classes, and of pollution. And this is important to understand, because it's one of those things that show you that modernity, as we iconographically or stereotypically imagine it, isn't something that is born literally, on year 492 onwards. It's something that started from much before, depending on which standards you want to take. So obviously there was never a Middle Ages, there was never a modern age. It was just an extremely complex society that kept evolving and having, you know, all these various and very diversified activities that all interacted one another, and producing sometimes this new changes that, albeit intensifying much later, were still present there many centuries before. This had been a problem also of the ancient world. Like, so everywhere there was a sort of, we can't start using the term industrial if you know, it's like with all these modern terms, what is industry? You know, it just, you can define the word as much as you like, putting a standard measure wherever you want, so you can start talking of things like serious production of industries. Textile industry is a term you find, historiographically speaking, when you talk about the Middle Ages, these big trade centers of Flanders, of Italy, that were producing big quantities of material with large facilities, with thousands of people working with them. And of course, it's not the Industrial Revolution, has not the steam engine here, it has different methods, but at the same time, similar things happen. So that's where you put the balance. You know, is steam engine really the point you want to start reasoning like that? Because organizational problems are the ones that, aside from the technological ones, are the most important, actually, in absolute terms. So this come to influence and to inform the whole system of production in many ways. Excuse me, I drink a little before we go on. Speaking of textile manufacturing, there are three major innovations that took place in the Middle Ages. The first one is the hand spinning machine. The second, the high warp loom, that was so costly that was a pretty important possession for every tailor, and sometimes it was even rented for, you know, that this was also another way of making money, for telling you how remunerative the same production was, so that you can even rent the mean of production to someone else when you have it yourself, right? But this has also to do with other social and economical problems. And the fulling mill, that is in fact the mill to full the clothes that served basically to thicken the fabric by banging the fibers, right? So exploiting the fulling mill is not something. It was invented in the Middle Ages, but at this time gets revived once again because fulling this clothes had become more important, because there were more people who would buy that, right? So this is something. This mills is something you can find back as in ancient Mesopotamian civilization, thousands of years before. But you find here being revived, and this is, by the way, something that never quite died out. In historically speaking, that is, yeah, in early medieval times you see these things less, but there were actually. There were still, especially in certain regions that had known it before. Obviously, of course, in some other areas that had been imported by the Romans, built in there into this greater system, that this system of economical system kind of comes apart. Certain places maintain that, certain places do not really need it anymore, so they don't have fulling mills once again. So, but it's always dictated on the local conditions, and those were quite economically, quite rationally thought. So if we find that some technology had disappeared, it's not because people had become kind of dumb or incapable or barbaric or whatever you want to think of it, but simply because it didn't serve anymore. It was not convenient anymore. It costed too much. It was better to do something that kind of looks more primitive, less sophisticated, but it was at that time more effective to live better, right? which naturally can correspond to a general crisis. This doesn't mean that you got it better continuously. There are evidently moments of regression, etc. But still, people are not dumb. If you have to to starve to death, well, and with something that it's kind of more sophisticated, and then you can live with something way more simple, well, you go for the second option, I'd say. In the cities, within the cities, there was also the development of a new system of so-called scattered manufacturing, which means that the various phases of the production of clothes were entrusted to several groups of specialized workers that all had, in fact, their own business, their own different knowledge, craft, etc. Among this emerged the dyers that worked with very complex instruments and also with rather expensive raw materials. In this whole economical picture, the importance of precious metal was crucial, like today still. So the mineral area in Europe, let's say the mineral area per excellence in Europe was Saxony, northern Germany. So from here came the most famous miners. Also Bohemia was quite famous for this. And the manufacturing of iron and of weapons also found a great development this time, a great improvement, especially in the Rhineland in Germany and in Lombardy, especially in the cities of Milan and Brescia that were closer to this metal, these mines of iron. The Rhineland was a quite important metallurgical center since actually late antiquity. In the ancient world, the most famous mineral center in Europe, at least in terms of for weapons production, was in part was Spain, telling the truth, but more famously it was Noricum. So roughly today's Austria, and then eventually towards late Roman Empire, also the Germans came to take over those places. The ancient know-how of the Noricum area, by the way, was a Celtic area, was transferred into the Rhineland, chiefly the Upper Rhineland, and in fact, even during Carolingian times, etc., the finest blades produced in Europe came from there. There was also an international export at the time. Europe exported weapons. It remained, even still at this time, a great part of minerals. Interestingly enough, these swords were largely sold even to the Muslims in southern Mediterranean, and there was a big deal here because obviously several communities made a freaking lot of money by exporting these weapons, even to the infidels they were fighting during the Crusades. But hey, money is money, and also this kind of dichotomy Christian-Muslim was pretty fluid, pretty blurred at that time in terms of allegiance to money. So and there were even problems like the popes forbid the sellings, etc. The Venetians usually were monopolizing the exports. They sold this weaponry and slaves like from the Balkans and all this stuff. So that tells you, it's rather controversial if you were to think about it, but it's still how it worked at the time, and evidently those were the ways it had the channels through which it was more convenient to make it work. The other most important centers, we say now, the ones in Lombardy, that is pretty strange because actually Italy doesn't have never quite had much of a minery has never been particularly rich in metals. The major mines, in fact, were exactly there at the Alpine foothills in Lombardy, and partly also on the Elba Island. Then there were definitely also other mines in Sardinia, but those were mostly for precious metals. So when it came to armory production, these were Lombardy was particularly important. And it was particularly important, not much just because of the quantity of metal available, but because those were particularly wealthy areas that had a lot of money to invest into mineral extraction, into the means of production, their organization. I made a video that talks exactly about this. That is called like the material wealth of like of communal infantry, something like that. It takes into consideration exactly Milan. It was full of these armors, and that had this better organized means of production, etc. They exported their blades, their armor as well, not just weapons, all over Europe. And as we were saying, yesterday when talking about the Burgundian army, they made still at the end of the Middle Ages some of the best actually arms and armor available because of this organization. So here you see once again, it's not even a matter of the availability of material, but also the ability of producing, having labor strength and a profitable economical trade, let's say connection, etc. And so we were saying before, this is kind of weird because even this is the moment in which the trade balance of Europe became favorable. Up to that point, the Muslim world had the upper hand. Now on, but also from some century before, the Muslims were used to fight with so-called Frankish swords. That is simply Western swords, because the Frankish world was this synecdoche, let's say, used for defining the whole continental Europe, and the Muslims imported both raw metal that eventually they would work in some specialized places, like into Spain, famously in Toledo, and then or in Syria, with and rather also famously into Damascus. So the blades of Toledo and Damascus were the best ones, renowningly, and they, however, came in part with material extracted into Christian lands. Sometimes the Muslims, of course, also bought the manufactured swords that were already produced in there. They were completed. Then, of course, sometimes just the blades were sold, and then the pommels, etc., the grips were mounted in other the hills, etc., were mounted in other places. But it was this very florid trade of arms, and during the 12th century, there is this major improvement also in the quality of metal. The progress in the field of metal working allowed to produce into this century the great the keyboard organs, for example, for the churches, or also the great bronze bells of the European cathedrals. Thinking about the Teutonic knights in the Baltic lands that went to fight, bringing alongside with the army this huge keyboard organs and playing them before the battle. Well, this was a product already of this metallurgical, let's say, these technical improvements. And the strictly metallurgical improvements is evident because at this point there is an increased production of let's say of more carbured metal, right? The problem with at this point there's all this debate whether iron is just iron or steel. Actually, if you were to judge from a strictly chemical point of view, like if you just take into consideration the actual element that is either iron and this minor quantity of carbon, you see that steel is, you can say it existed even in the ancient world. Now, many people get picky about this because they say, well, but because it's like with the concept of modern or medieval, right? There is a general improvement for which you say that from a certain point of view, a certain perfectionment of this metallurgical production brought to the more exact percentage of carbon that was to make the iron blade better, kind of more flexible, more resistant, etc. And therefore they tend to discard everything that happened before. Just for the record, when we judge those that steel from late modern times, etc., or even for modern engineering standards, that's not steel anymore, because our the engineering standards today are so, on other levels that they don't consider even what was considered at the time rightfully, because that was, from a chemical point of view, steel as steel, right? So saying that before the 12th century there was some kind of no steel, it's kind of weird. You can't say all much you like that before the 12th century or other centuries like the 13th, because, by the way, this is actually very complicated. It's even in the 12th there was not a massive improvement. The biggest one was effectively at the very end of the Middle Ages during the 15th century, but we will get this in a greater detail some other time. I don't remember what I was saying. Oh yeah, there was no metal before, no steel before. It's kind of wrong. There is no doubt that the steel was better at this point than it was before. It's obvious. It was better than Roman times. Much better. It made a difference on the field, actually. But it's still, chemically speaking, if you take the individual elements, you realize what is their combination in the substance. And also, it's not just that. It's also a very difficult. It also depends on which kind of material you use, how you produce that, because, by the way, these guys didn't quite know what was the deal. They knew they had to oxygenate this. It's very complicated, but they kind of knew how to do it empirically, and they knew how to do it very well. All these were all ancient wisdoms that in fact already existed from quite a time. Sometimes they were even mythical. I mean, if you look at these legendary blades into Germanic epics and all this stuff, they were thought they were magic, and there were even the rhythms of for making wrought iron and all this stuff were based on of certain chants that were meant to be divine and invoking the divinity. All this idea that they didn't quite rationalize what they were doing, but still they were able to do it through that, right? So they knew they would obtain that result. It's an extremely fascinating yet complicated topic. We can't talk about it now because it's not exactly about this, but it's kind of still steel, in fact, but it was better. And in fact, also the Toledo and Damascus steels or the Yemenite blades were particularly famous because the metal that they used, that was sometimes more rich in carbon with the right proportion, etc. That's why, by the way, the mines of Noricum were so famous initially, because they had this greater amount of carbon from the average iron that they were extracted elsewhere. So aside from this, there is a strong improvement into this, and the means sometimes was also creating the right ovens. The problem also came here for making the foundry oven reaching a certain amount of temperature, because the problem was exactly that you can achieve this process better the higher the temperature is, because it allows you to melt better and to blend better the various elements. So a great part of this progress happened through the construction of not just larger ovens, but also of the insufflating system, because this was the problem, that it started becoming hydraulic. So with a force that, because the problem is that the oven has to be kept regularly at the same temperature in order to achieve these working with this blending of the elements. So before, the Europeans didn't have that kind of technology. They didn't have enough wealth to invest into these things. They didn't have these hydraulic pumps that pushed oxygen into the furnace, and therefore they couldn't achieve that level of quality. Why is that? For example, the Indian Woods steel so prized at the time? It was one of, by the way, was pretty similar as far as I know to, in fact, the Yemenite one, the blades of Damascus, etc. Because the Indians had they didn't use hydraulic pumps in order to insufflate oxygen, but they used the monsoons, because the monsoon kind of blows pretty potently for like 6 months in a row. It's very constant, so it always allows the kind of the same amount of oxygen being injected into this furnace, and therefore that was the ideal. And that's why, for example, in India, that kind of steel was so fine, because they had this means. So you see how all elements that technologies that stem from sometimes even very casual and not non. I mean, they're still kind of structural reasons, but they stem from several different factors, right? So looking a bit in general at the resources of the of medieval Europe, let's take into consideration a bit of this. For example, where the most fertile areas in general? Where were cereals produced? Well, of course, looking a bit scattered, well, Castile was fairly fertile. Certain regions around Toulouse, the county of Toulouse, that not surprisingly was very rich. Areas around in Aquitaine, north of Aquitaine, along the Loire River in France. Flanders, definitely fairly fertile. England, the northeast of London is fertile as well. In part, certain regions around in the Ile-de-France, in other areas of the Rhineland, for instance. Northern Italy, Lombardy, is particularly fertile. Sicily, that has this massive grain exports. If you look south at the Mediterranean, also, for example, a region like Morocco has. And then, by the way, it's pretty interesting, because if you look at all these centers, you realize that they're kind of all around some of the most developed places around. Morocco, in that case, had a dynasty ruling. Then we talk about Castile, with the Kingdom of Castile, the Ile-de-France, that had Paris, London, Flanders, with some of the most advanced regions out there. Lombardy was like kind of the wealthiest place all over there. Sicily, that had the kingdom on its own. Other fertile areas that start becoming such because feudalism expands and is able to put into agricultural land places, say, to turn fertile places that previously were pretty difficult to cultivate, are all this wide area in what would be today's northeastern Germany and western Poland, shifting in the south towards even places like Krakow. Also the Pannonian Basin. Also in here, there is, Krakow was the Polish capital at that point. The Pannonian Basin was the center of the Kingdom of Hungary. Wallachia is pretty fertile too, historically speaking. This area between the southern Carpathian Basin and the Danube River. And then obviously the Ukraine, southern Ukraine especially, very, very fertile. The Genoese get up into Crimea exactly to export this grain, sometimes all over Europe. So this was quite an important center. The main trade centers, by the way, were pretty much associated to these ones. I mean, if you look at for instance, the great English ports with London, Southampton, Bristol, and others, but also with other, other cities. Maybe not Portugal center, but quite important trade centers, definitely into Flanders. Then into Italy, that was the crossroad of all Mediterranean continental traffics. Think about Venice, Genoa, but also the same cities of Milan, Piacenza, Pisa, by the way. And in France, southern France, Marseille, Köln, Cologne, on the Rhine in Germany, and also the most important city of the Hanseatic League, Lübeck, in northeastern Germany, and these other cities of Danzig or Stettin connected to the sea. Even the far north with Stockholm or Bergen in Sweden and Norway respectively are quite important centers, right? Barcelona, Palma in Spain. So and actually some other big centers that existed eastwards in the eastern Mediterranean, like Constantinople, several cities on the what would be today western Turkish coast, also of Crete, Crimea, that we think about Kaffa, we mentioned before because of Genoese colonization, but also Cyprus, that was quite important also logistically for the Crusader states in the Near East at this point. The major metallurgical industries, as we've said before, were chiefly into Germany, into Italy. You find something also in Lyon as well. Thinking about wool and sheep, so this wool was particularly important for that cloth industry we were talking about before. So famously enough, Scotland, England were made quite of an export of this material. It usually was brought into Flanders and from there exported. Also, the Italians start, going all around the Iberian Peninsula, Gibraltar Strait, just to reach to London and kind of go straight, take the wool directly from there in competition with the Flemish. Definitely central Spain, the Iberian Peninsula has a pretty consistent wool production. Central Italy has too. I made, by the way, a video about this too, about the Castilian and Neapolitan wool export towards the late Middle Ages. It was massive. It was really a huge amount of this stuff. If you go, I don't remember now what's the title, but it was something. If you type transhumans, you should find that. It's one of the very few videos on YouTube that talk about that. You should find mine pretty easy. It's like transhumans in late medieval times, something like that. Certain areas, Serbia in the Balkans, also produced wool. Also, certain parts of Provence in southern France had. Then olive oil. Olive oil is definitely mostly a Mediterranean prerogative at this point. Certain coastal centers of Spain were particularly important for this. Tuscany was important for this. For wine as well. Wine Burgundy we mentioned before. It was this like the capital of wine in many ways, but of course also Italy and even Spain, etc., had this production. France obviously as well, quite important wine producer aside from Burgundy, let's say. By the way, Burgundy at this time was usually conceived like another nation compared to France or to Provence. Like there were different chunks of even in terms of, in fact, of trade activities, of production, etc. saffron could be found in the trade markets of southern Italy, of Catalonia. There were in this you have to think also, as we were saying before, about the importance of waterways, and importance of fordings, of places with bridges, like centers like Bourges, for instance, were quite or Piacenza were quite important to this, because they were built over, they had bridges over through which major trade flows passed. Quite important at this time, by the way. A very important facility is the one, the production is the one of paper. Paper starts being produced massively. It was coming from the Islamic world. It seems that the very first paper mills were into Catalonia, northeastern Spain, but eventually it's central Italy that becomes like the major exports throughout all over Europe, especially the city of Fabriano. Produces this enormous amount of paper. Also in there you had to have water, force, mills, etc. So also in there it was also a matter of specialization, etc. There were important productions of also salt was a primary resource at the time, because either it was maritime salt or rock salt. That was one of the few substances that at the time could preserve food. Very important centers in this sense were present once again in Catalonia, in southern Italy, also in northeastern Italy, partly in Austria. Salzburg takes its name, Burg of the Salt, right? This was from Salzburg. The salt was exported along the Danube up to the Black Sea in Constantinople. That's what they started making a freaking lot of money there. The Archbishopric of Germany. I mean I don't remember how it's called in the ecclesiastical hierarchy, but let's say whatever. Oh yeah, Salzburg is the primate of Germany. Yeah, that's what I wanted to say. The Dalmatian coast and the City Republic of Ragusa produced a lot of salt. The whole Atlantic coast of France produced a freaking lot of salt. England partly as well. And other regions, even even central Italy in part produced this. Also Portugal, another Atlantic region, produced salt. Rock salt was to be found in Krakow too, as well, that I remember, so even Poland has this precious resource. The Balearic Islands as well. What else? Well, even coral, like from Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, southern Spain, that was quite of a resource. And alum was mostly produced in the east, in the islands of the Turkish coast as well. The Genoese kind of monopolized that as well during their expansion in their supporting the Byzantines against the French. And what else? We can talk about definitely a lot of material. For example, lead that was present in Britain, quite a consistent measure. There is this other precious resource that is sulfur, that will be particularly important, especially from the late Middle Ages onwards, for black powder production up to the 19th century. Like the major sulfur production in the world was in Sicily, and this was to be found. Yeah, and more or less we could talk endlessly actually about these resources. Maybe one day we will make a more detailed video actually about the various resources to be found all over medieval Europe. But more or less, for today, we have given a look at these aspects, and we will keep talking about medieval economy in the future. And for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.